Well, it's Easter, so we ought to talk wine. And Australian wine, we're told, this happened yesterday, is back on the menu as China has ended those crippling tariffs that could see the country return to being Australia wine industry's biggest export market. The Albanese government announced this yesterday. The PM was in the Hunter Valley. He was visiting a winery, and it seems like the industry is celebrating. Joining me now is the Australian Grape and Wine CEO, McLean. Lee, a bit of an industry celebrations last night, or too early to tell?
No, look, it's really good news, Steve, and thanks for having me on the program. We've been going through a couple of years of very difficult times after the imposition of those tariffs on Australian wines, and the announcement last night that those tariffs will be lifted is great news for grape growers and winemakers in Australia.
The numbers that we heard, Lee, when the tariffs first went on and then in the announcement yesterday was extraordinary. Did I see that we went from $1 billion export industry to China to somewhere around the tens of millions of dollars? I mean, that's falling off a cliff.
We absolutely did fall off a cliff. So at its peak, we were exporting about $1.2 billion worth of wine to the Chinese market, and after those import duties were imposed, that went right down to less than $10 million per year in terms of exports. So an extraordinary drop, and that had an enormous impact on the entire sector, but particularly for grape growers and winemakers in certain regions where they were growing red wine, which was the main sort of wine of choice for Chinese consumers. They found it very, very difficult to deal with that sort of shock.
How quickly will the feedback come from your former Chinese customers who clearly loved Australian red wine, as you say in particularly, but high-end red wine? It was massively popular in parts of China, wasn't it?
Absolutely. So, look, I think for most of our businesses, I don't think anyone is expecting that we're going to get back to that $1.2 billion figure, at least not in the short to medium term. It's going to take some time for us to rekindle those relationships. But the fact of the matter is, the data tells us Chinese consumers still really enjoy the product we make. They are drinking a little bit less these days. The market's changed, but they are still drinking wines at premium price points. And that's an area of the market that we've done really well in the past. So we're hoping that we can get some great Australian wines back in the hands of Chinese consumers before too long.
Would have been hardly to see any silver lining in that whole post pre-COVID and COVID time. But if there was a silver lining, diversity was forced upon a lot of our winemakers, and other markets were opened up. And I guess that taught everybody a lesson that diversification is pretty important.
Yeah, look, a lot of businesses were forced to diversify following those import duties. We were already exporting to more than 100 countries at that time, but the reality is China was by far and away our largest export market. So we've had to work doubly hard to try to grow market opportunities around the world. It's slow going, it's hard, but we're starting to see some good growth opportunities in Southeast Asia, for example. And in the long run, we hope that we can continue to work on markets like India, which could provide enormous opportunities for us in the future, but that's a bit of a way away.
I heard a winemaker on Talkback Radio this morning from All Saints in northeast Victoria, I think, lamenting the fact that no one was quite sure when this was going to happen, when those tariffs were going to come off. And so there was a bit of a cutback in production in either the amount of vines being grown or the amount that were harvested. Has that been a challenge for the industry as well?
Yeah, look, it's always a challenge for grape growers and winemakers when they're making decisions about production at the beginning of vintage or even beforehand, to know exactly what to do. There was some uncertainty around the time frame of this decision, but what we did know was that 5 months ago, the Australian government, the Chinese government, reached that agreement, which has led to this decision being made through a review process. So we knew roughly about this time we were going to get a decision one way or another, but we were, of course, not sure what decision that was going to take. So, look, it's good news that we're here now, and certainly, hopefully, it allows for some better planning in the future from our grape growers and winemakers as well.
obviously, the vineyards of Australia are spread across very different climates around the country. I heard that same winemaker this morning saying they finished vintage yesterday. In general terms, and I know we can't be specific on the Hunter's different to the Barossa. What's the vintage this season looking like? Is it looking like a bumper year?
Look, it's very hard to tell in terms of volumes at this point in time, but from what we're hearing anecdotally, the numbers look like they're going to be quite down in terms of yield. So it's been a fairly cool summer in many parts of the country, and then we had quite a heat wave in some key growing regions as well, which kind of compressed the vintage and made everyone work pretty hard to get the grapes off in time and in the right sort of way. So I think quality is going to be looking pretty good, but I dare say that yields are going to be down, which perhaps if you're ever going to have a lower vintage, now might be the time to have it, because we've still got an enormous amount of red wine sitting in tanks and barrels and bottles that we need to clear over the next couple of years.
One of my favourite things, Lee, a decent Peking duck and a glass of Pinot Noir. That's what the Chinese will be saying tonight as well, I think. Lee McLean, thanks for your time.
Thanks very much, Steve.